Vinoth Ramachandra, who's going to be giving our next lecture. Vinoth's background is in nuclear engineering, where he originally studied at Queen Mary and Imperial Colleges. He's since worked in Sri Lanka, where he's currently he's an Anglican lay preacher in the Diocese of Colombo. His role is he's Secretary for Dialogue and Social Engagement in the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and has particular interest in a holistic view of engagement with universities. And he's written a number of things. I'm going to draw attention particularly, there's a couple of his books on the bookstall. The book Gods That Fall, and there are a number of copies of that on the bookstall you might like to look at, and more especially to buy afterwards. So enough of introductions. Over to Ramoth, to Vinoth, who's going to talk to us on God and natural evil.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's a great joy and an honor to be back at the Faraday Institute after about 10 years, I think. I'm a great admirer and supporter of your work, and I always recommend the Faraday to science students and science professors around the world with whom I work. I should say at the outset that I'm obviously speaking as a Christian, and I'm going to be engaging with biblical Christian theology on the subject that was given to me, God and natural evil. But I hope that what I say will be of interest to those of you who are not Christians, that it will stimulate you to explore and engage with your own faith traditions, and share with us in the discussion time how you see the way your traditions have engaged with this subject. Traditionally, the term natural evil has been applied by many theologians and philosophers to, firstly, in biology, to refer to the presence of suffering, death, and extinction in the animal world, and then in geophysics, with reference to things like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, and other severe climatic events that wreak destruction on humans and other animals on a large scale. So I'm going to be looking at both these, and let's begin with the animal world and animal predation. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel works of nature, observed Charles Darwin in a letter to a friend. And Darwin's best-known current interpreter, Richard Dawkins, in his book River Out of Eden, writes, "During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear, others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites, thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease." The wanton suffering inflicted by humans on animals is a symptom of human moral perversity. It's raised questions for centuries as to why a good and all-powerful God permits it. The infliction of suffering on animals by other animals has received much less attention. But it also casts doubt on the goodness of the temporal order that God has established in creation. The natural world is filled with animals that are biologically designed in their internal organs, instincts, and every aspect of physiology to exist by consuming other creatures. From parasitic wasps to lions and tigers, these are irreducibly predatory. And yet these creatures play a vital role in the cycles of life and death, the great economy of nature, in which all creatures must die, and in dying make it possible for other creatures to be. But there does seem to be an excess to predation, which bears comparison with the gratuitous slaughter that human beings inflict on each other and on other living species. With the exception of human beings, killer whales are Earth's most capable predators. When they evolved 10 million years ago, half of Earth's whales and seals became extinct. As a result of global warming, killer whales have appeared again in Arctic waters. Horrified Inuit described them as voracious and wasteful killers that have reduced populations of some Arctic mammals by as much as a third. It's surprising how many thoughtful Christians assume a pre-Darwinian view in treating animal pain and death as a consequence of a human fall. In this, I suggest they could learn from St. Thomas Aquinas, who 600 years before Darwin wrote, "For the nature of animals was not changed by man's sin, as if those whose nature now is to devour the flesh of others, such as the lion and the falcon, would then have lived on herbs." The intelligent design movement advocate William Dembski believes that for theological reasons, we must attribute all natural evil to the sin of Adam and Eve, but for scientific reasons, we must think of it as effective retroactively. Dembski is suggesting that in his foreknowledge, God decreed animal predation millions of years ago, before the creation of humanity, in order to somehow contain and punish human sin. A little bit like firefighters making backfires in anticipation of a coming blaze. God brings about natural evil, declares Dembski, to free us from the more insidious evil in our hearts. He's vague on how this actually happens, but clearly Adam and Eve are held morally responsible for natural evil even before humanity appears on the scene. The great predators, with their sharp incisors, talons, claws, and digestive tracts capable of only processing meat, owe their existence, in other words, to human sin. In his 1940 book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis rightly cautioned that whatever we say on the subject of animal suffering is going to be highly speculative, as we have no direct access to the inner life of animals. He warned against the pathetic fallacy, that is, the fallacy of reading into animal behavior our own human experience, especially our moral experience, as when we apply terms such as cruel or selfish or vicious to creatures who are simply following their biological instincts. When an eagle swoops on a salmon to feed its young, does it make sense to describe this as cruel or selfish on the part of the eagle and to mourn the suffering of the salmon? Lewis also reminded us that sentience and consciousness exist at different ontological levels. A sentient creature might pass through a series of discrete connected states, but since it lacks consciousness and therefore subjectivity, it cannot form an experience of pain by connecting those discrete states. Lewis also invoked an ancient Orthodox Christian tradition in seeing the problem of evil as predating the emergence of human beings. There was a cosmic fall involving rebellious angels, and this cosmic fall has left its corrupting imprint on the earth of living creatures. So Lewis writes, if this hypothesis is worth considering, it's also worth considering whether man, at his first coming into the world, had not already a redemptive function to perform. It may have been one of man's functions to restore peace to the animal world, and if he had not joined the enemy, he might have succeeded in doing so to an extent now hardly imaginable. Attractive as Lewis's proposal regarding humans' redemptive function is, his cosmic conflict theodicy leaves unresolved how these malignant powers originated and why God should allow them to wreak such havoc over long periods of evolutionary history. Lewis also seems to be giving satanic agency more than its due. For when we turn to the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, there's no hint at all that animal pain and predation are natural evils and markers of a physical creation that's been corrupted by demonic powers. So, for example, the God who addresses Job from out of the whirlwind takes full responsibility for the wildness and ferocity of nature in all its multifarious and bewildering forms. In Job 38, verse 25, we read of God carving a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt, providing meat for young lions and ravens. Verse 41, commanding the eagle to make its nest on high, from where it spies the prey, so that its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. That's 39 verses 27 to 30. And in the great paean of praise to the God of nature, Psalm 104, we read, quote, the young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God, unquote. It is to Darwin that we owe the idea that the descent with modification of all living things was mainly driven by processes of natural selection, in which the overproduction of offspring leads to competition for limited resources, and out of the variety of individuals in a population, some are found to be at a selective advantage over others. In fact, reproduction seems an utterly wasteful and inefficient process. For instance, out of 10,000 eggs laid in a frog's lifetime, on average only 2 survive to breed. 14 out of 16 starlings die without breeding, and human biology is no less wasteful. In an ejaculation of up to 200 million genetically unique sperm, only one will fertilize a genetically unique egg if there is an egg around, and only just a third of fertilized eggs will produce a baby. The explanation of these numbers is to be found not only in predation, and that's not applicable in the human case, but also in the number of abnormalities that inevitably arise from genetic, including chromosomal mutations. And these mutations are the fundamental process that drive all evolution, and which, insofar as it is largely unrelated to the needs of the organism, may be properly described as chance. Dennis Alexander, who is with us this morning, reminds us in his book, Rebuilding the Matrix, that carbon-based organisms, which are the only types that exist on planet Earth, can only live by feeding on carbon-based molecules derived from other plants and animals. No multicellular animal can live by deriving all its energy needs from chemical elements. All are completely dependent on the food chain, whereby organic molecules synthesized in other organisms are passed on to them. Dennis writes, I quote, "A world like our own, without biological death of any kind, would be a magical world, a nonsensical world by any understanding of the properties of matter. Even if an organism as relatively simple as a bacterium continued to divide in an unrestricted manner without death, its mass would soon fill the whole earth, its nutrients would become depleted, and death would be inevitable. Carbon-based life and death are biologically so integrated that life is impossible without death." End of quote. Not all biologists adopt Lord Tennyson's gloomy view of a nature red in tooth and claw. Indeed, Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of evolution through natural selection, was of the opinion that, quote, "the amount of actual suffering caused by the struggle for existence among animals is altogether insignificant," unquote. And you know that Darwin himself was impressed by altruistic behavior between as well as within species. The role of whole castes of sterile bees helping fertile bees to reproduce was a problem that troubled him for many years. And in the 6th edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin acknowledged that the wide extent of altruistic behavior in insects and other creatures might prove fatal to his entire theory of natural selection. Furthermore, our nervous system has been shaped by millions of years of evolution to generate different experiences of pain. And these experiences have ensured our survival. The mammals whose nervous systems were deficient and failed to pass urgent messages back to the brain are presumably amongst those species that became extinct and failed to pass their genes on to others. So Dennis Alexander again writes, without pain, we would be walking around on broken legs, happily going to school with meningitis, merrily ignoring fatal tumors, and munching on broken glass with rotting teeth. In short, our lives would be considerably briefer than they are now. Through struggle and pain, other values have also been enhanced in the biosphere. We admire the lithe beauty of antelopes and springbok in their movements, forgetting that in Holmes Rolston's resonant phrase, it was the cougar's fang that has carved the limbs of the fleet-footed deer, and vice versa. Further, as Michael Pollan writes, quote, without predators to cull the herd, deer overrun their habitat and starve. All suffer, and not only the deer, but the plants they browse and every other species that depends on those plants. In a sense, the good life for deer and even their creaturely character, which has been forged in the crucible of predation, depends on the existence of the wolf. From the point of view of the individual prey, animal predation is a horror. But from the point of view of the group and of its gene pool, it is indispensable. So whose point should we favor? That of the individual bison, or bison with a capital B, the pig, or pig with a capital P? Much depends on how you choose to answer that question. Now, how we answer that question will surely depend on the level of cognitive sophistication of the individual creature involved. It's unsurprising that many of the features that we associate with the human condition, such as tool making, cultures, and emotion, are recognizable in a rudimentary form among some other non-human animals. There's no doubt that elephants, for example, or some of the higher apes, dolphins, and domesticated dogs do have an emotional life. They have perhaps even a nascent moral awareness. Whether these animals also have some sense of the sacred, the numinous, whether this is mediated through their contact with human beings or independent of human beings, these are unanswerable. But if they do, we can be assured that the Creator's relationship with them is appropriate to their level of responsiveness. We know that clans of female elephants led by matriarchs periodically associate in larger groups, and so strong is elephant empathy that they sometimes bury their dead and will return repeatedly to the skeleton of a deceased matriarch to fondle her tusks and bones. Elephants have been known to extract spears from wounded friends and to stay with infants that are born with disabilities. We can overstress the role of natural selection and competition on the evolutionary process. Random genetic drift and geographical isolation are more benign factors, and cooperation, starting at the level of individual cells, is just as necessary for survival. Indeed, there is as much cooperation in biology as there is competition. An enormous step was taken in our evolutionary past when an eukaryotic cell, one with a true nucleus, came about through the cooperative union of 2 or 3 prokaryotic cells, that is, cells without nuclei. Furthermore, biology is about organisms, not just about molecules and cells, and organisms depend on ecosystems embedded in the biosphere. both of which are examples of large-scale cooperative behavior between millions of species acting over long periods of time. Mutualism and symbiosis, organisms living together in a state of mutual dependence, such as the bacteria in our guts, from which we benefit as well as they. These are a universal feature of the biological world. And the atmosphere on which we and all known animals depend was originally produced by single-celled bacteria patiently working for about 2 billion years to remove the methane that was the main constituent of the Earth's early atmosphere, and to turn enough of the carbon dioxide into oxygen. Let me move on now to evolution and eschatology. From a Christian perspective that sees the world as God's creation, evolution has been a means of producing the amazing diversity of life forms, both diachronically across eons of adaptation and extinctions, and synchronically in the living web of interconnected ecosystems. Both the life-generating ecosystems that give humans birth and also the other sentient creatures that share the planet Earth with us constitute an interlocking web of life. Moreover, we can only understand the present creation from an eschatological perspective. There's an enigmatic statement in Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, right at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, where Mark refers to Jesus being in the wilderness with the wild animals. And this may be seen as an anticipation of a future world when the dread of humanity, which has befallen the non-human world, is removed. And it comes on the heels of Jesus' identification as the Messianic Son of God, Mark 1, verse 11. And it needs to be read against the background of Old Testament eschatological hopes as expressed in Isaiah 11, or Job 5, or Hosea 2, verse 18, which speak of the coming Davidic Messiah and his reign. In Jesus, the Messianic reign has dawned, and this reign includes the healing of enmity between humankind and the wild animals. Human dominion, which was perverted into domination and mutual alienation by human sin, will be restored. And in Jesus' peaceful companionship with the wild animals, we are given a foretaste of that eschatological restoration. Jesus neither terrorizes nor domesticates the wild animals. He's simply with them. And in that pregnant phrase, with the wild animals, Mark gives us a powerful reminder of the value of the non-human creation in the eyes of God. Human dominion restored in Jesus, the new Adam, enables the wild animals to find their appropriate place in the wilderness as creatures who share God's world with us. The well-known passage in Romans 8 also points in the same direction. The vast majority of commentators understand this text as pointing to the reconciliation of all things in Christ that the great Christological texts, such as Colossians 1 and Ephesians 1, describe. We read that it is in hope that the Creator has subjected the present creation to entropy, to decay, to death, to disintegration. The present created order is good, but it's incomplete. It was never the Creator's final word on his creation. The latter is currently groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, awaiting the dawn of a new creation in which it will find its created destiny, alongside the liberation and transformation of the human children of God. As to what aspects of the present creation this refers to, animate and inanimate, it's best to adopt a stance of humble agnosticism. All we can say is that, like the resurrection body of Jesus, there will be both continuity and discontinuity between the present world order and the new regenerate world order. But the world is not going to be destroyed, but rather transformed and suffused with the glory of the triune God. But in our environmentally sensitive age, theologians who are anxious to rid theology of its anthropocentric baggage have not been averse to throwing caution to the winds and indulging in speculation. So, for example, Christopher Southgate writes that extinction of a species means the loss of a whole way of being alive on the planet, a whole aspect of the goodness of creation, a whole way of praising God. And he insists that the Creator's justice will be vindicated if and only if every individual animal, and not merely every animal species, is resurrected on the last day, along with human beings. Underlying this thought is an assumption that whatever is transient carries no value, that value pertains only to that which is permanently enduring. Now, I find this a rather strange argument. The notion that whatever comes into existence and passes out of existence has no value in itself is a notion more in tune with Hellenistic or Hindu-Buddhist philosophy than Judeo-Christian. For example, a musical note or a chord is transient, but it is what contributes to the making of the whole symphony. And even if the symphony itself fades into oblivion, as do all our cultural and technological artifacts, who would deny that it was deeply valued and treasured by many? Moreover, an oak tree produces millions of acorns with only one surviving to replace itself. Is each acorn to become a mighty oak in the new creation? A bullfrog can lay 25,000 eggs in a clutch and lay more than one clutch a season. Does the risen Jesus resurrect all these frogs? Even vegetarian lions and resurrected prey would have to eat shrubs and grass. And when these resurrected vegetarians eat fruit, they kill the seeds within. If human life terminates at death, does it mean that a human life has no value at all? Well, the saints of the whole Old Testament did not think so. I believe that every human being's life does not end with death. But I cannot make sense of extending this thought to every dinosaur or mastodon, let alone every rodent or cockroach that I have killed. In similar vein, Jürgen Moltmann declares that the raised body of Christ has a transfiguring efficacy that reaches to animals, plants, stones, and all cosmic life systems. And elsewhere he writes, there is no redemption for human beings without the redemption of nature. But Romans 8 seems to put it the other way around, that there is no redemption for nature without the redemption of human beings. Moltmann further states, and I quote, "Not even the best of all possible stages of evolution justifies acquiescence in evolution's victims as the unavoidable fertilizers of the future. There is therefore no meaningful hope for the future of creation unless the tears are wiped from every eye. But they can only be wiped when the dead are raised and when the victims of evolution experience justice through the resurrection of nature. Evolution in its ambiguity has no such redemptive efficacy and therefore no salvific significance either. If Christ is to be thought of in conjunction with evolution, he must become evolution's redeemer." Now, I confess I frankly don't know what biological sense, let alone philosophical or theological sense, can be made of notions like the victims of evolution. or Christ as evolution's redeemer, given what I stated earlier about the way that evolution actually works. Moltmann clearly regards all death in nature as unnatural, even a tragic destiny. And this is where I find Richard Baucham's critique of Moltmann very helpful. For Baucham writes, at this point one may want to ask questions. Does death really have the same significance for every kind of creature? For elephants who mourn their dead, it is a tragic destiny, as it is for us. But for this year's marigolds, which die in the annual cycle of death, and new life that will produce next year's marigolds, is death tragic? Need we mourn the individual marigold as we certainly would the species, should it become extinct? The Danish theologian Niels Henrik Gregersen has coined the term deep incarnation to speak of Christ's transformative presence within the cosmos. And Gregersen begins his exposition by stretching the meaning of the Greek word sarx. In the well-known text, John chapter 1, verse 14, the Word became sarx and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. He says that sarx refers not only to human flesh or even animal flesh, but to what he calls the whole malleable matrix of materiality. The whole malleable matrix of materiality. In other words, the divine Logos has summed up not merely humanity, but the whole realm of the material world, from quarks to atoms to molecules, in their combinations and transformations throughout chemical and biological evolution. The implication is, as Gregersen puts it, that God becomes Jesus, and in him God becomes human, and by implication foxes and sparrows, grass and soil. And he goes on that it is as natural for God to dwell in the world of dirt and waste as it is for God to be present in the uniquely human characteristics of highly developed consciousness, morality, religious imagination, and God consciousness. However, this claim is so theologically vague that it borders on an irresponsible flirtation with pantheism. For surely terms like natural and dwell in demand more nuanced explication. For what mode God's immanent presence in and for his creatures takes will surely depend on the nature of the particular creature involved. So God's active presence in evil situations cannot be the same as his presence in the pursuit of truth or goodness, let alone his indwelling presence in the church. And given the diversity and subtlety of God's relationships with his creatures, trying to encapsulate all these relationships within a single concept like incarnation is fraught with danger. So Baucham points out that what distinguishes the uniqueness of the incarnation is that in the humanity of Jesus Christ, God was not simply in his creation or with and for his creation, but he comes to us as the person Jesus Christ. Baucham writes, by incarnation as a particular human person, God is able to be with all other creatures, human and non-human, in their ecological interrelatedness, in a way that affirms their immense diversity and makes God himself incarnate as Jesus Christ their unifying center. It seems to me that this ecological interrelatedness of humans with other forms of life is a far better way of articulating how Christ's incarnation and resurrection benefit the non-human world than by arbitrarily extending the meanings of both incarnation and sarx. in order to be related to all other species, it's not necessary that humans should somehow sum up all other created natures in their own nature. This leaves room for recognizing diversity even in the destiny of present creaturely entities. Worms and viruses need not be resurrected, but perhaps elephants, dogs, and dolphins will. But with what new biological natures and obeying what new physical laws? These are beyond our imaginative capacities. So let's turn to natural disasters. When things go well, we simply don't believe in disasters. And that's why rational self-interest or long-term prudence in the face of threats such as climate change and global warming are too feeble motives for most people to change their ways of life for the sake of future generations. We need to suffer ourselves. And isn't it interesting how God never enters a picture when the media reports, for example, the growth of scientific understanding, say recent medical discoveries? These are all attributed solely to human genius. But God quickly becomes a scapegoat when things start going wrong, especially in the natural world. And one important question that's rarely raised is the following. Why is it that when hurricanes and earthquakes hit places like Florida or Japan, the loss of life is minimal? But when the same disasters occur in the Caribbean or in South Asia, the devastation is mind-boggling. And the answer is simple and straightforward: poverty. Or poverty combined with corruption and incompetence on the part of government officials. In South Asia, annual warnings about floods and cyclones are routinely ignored when the technology that's needed to save lives and property is readily available. Coral reefs and mangrove swamps that absorb much of the impact of tropical storms and ocean surges, these have virtually disappeared from our coastal belts. Information collected by satellites and seismic warning systems are owned by rich nations and rarely passed on to poorer nations. And poverty and economic inequalities on the scale that we see today in the world cannot be blamed on God. They represent a violation of God's will for humanity. Let me speak a little about creation, the doctrine of creation, which Bishop James began to unfold earlier this morning. Creation is a free decision of the triune God. It's a gratuitous gift. And every act of creation in human context, like parenting or composing music or writing a novel, they all involve an exercise of power, but also the self-limitation of that power. The Creator respects the integrity of his or her creation. So the relationship between Creator and creation cannot be adequately described in the language of controlling or even ruling, because there's also a letting be, a willingness to let the creation unfold in its own way according to its intrinsic character. So there's a mystery to every creative act that all great artists and musicians acknowledge. How much greater is the mystery when the topic is God's creation and sustaining of the universe. Modern science has given us a picture of God's world and of human life as evolving through a long process of potentialities that are progressively actualized in time. The world is not a closed, predictable system, but a place where genuine novelty emerges. If the universe was a linear, Newtonian, mechanical system, the future would, in a very real sense, be contained in the present, nothing genuinely new could happen. But in reality, our universe is not a linear Newtonian mechanical system. To recall an image that Professor John Polkinghorne has used, our world is made up of clouds as well as clocks. And clouds are far more difficult to study than clocks. They're examples of what physicists call chaotic or nonlinear dynamic systems. And most systems in the physical and biological world are of this type. These systems still obey the universal laws of physics, but their behavior is intrinsically unpredictable, as the possible solutions to the equations that describe them are indefinite. They are enveloped in probabilities, but future options are constrained within specific limits. And the paths followed by such systems are irreversible, so time now becomes significant, unlike in the mechanistic picture. So physical reality is more subtle than was thought of in earlier times. It's a complex interweaving of both necessity and contingency. Now, if God has chosen to create us humans as part of such a world, then we have emerged along with every other form of life on planet Earth out of the complex interactions of regularity and spontaneity. As physical beings, we share in the unpredictability and the vulnerability of the rest of the created order. Note that human finitude, human limitations are not evil. It's rather the rejection of finitude, the rejection of limitation, that the Bible calls sin. Our solidarity as a human species is what leads us to rejoice in the joy of others and to weep over the pain of others, and to only receive through the good that others do, but not to suffer the consequences of what others do. This would be a denial of our interdependent creatureliness. So suffering remains an unfathomable mystery. But we don't have to choose between a God who is an absentee landlord or a puppet master. In relation to moral evil, Christian theology has long argued in terms of human free will, that despite the many disastrous choices humans have made, a world of freely choosing beings is better than a world of perfectly programmed automata. In relation to physical evil, like disease and disaster, John Polkinghorne and others have proposed a free process defense, namely that God respects the relative autonomy of his creation. He allows the whole universe to become itself while sustaining the entire process by his love and wisdom. Each created entity is allowed to behave in accordance with its nature, including the complex combination of order and spontaneity, which is usually part of that nature. God neither wills the growth of cancerous tumors nor acts of terrorism, but he allows these to happen. The same process of gene mutations that lead to novel life forms also lead to the development of malignant tumors. As for earthquakes, the Earth's crust is constantly being reshaped by enormous tectonic forces underground. They create numerous ecological niches in which distinct and diverse forms of life may emerge. Heat produced by the decay of radioactive elements within the Earth causes slowly moving convection currents in the Earth's mantle. This is another nonlinear dynamic process. New oceanic crust is formed and plunges back into the mantle. The descending slabs of oceanic crust become strained and fracture. They cause earthquakes. And mountain ranges such as the Himalayas are formed this way. So earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other awesome natural events are not aspects of the fall, as has been understood in much of the Christian tradition. But they're rather the way that God has chosen to bring about ecological changes and biodiversity on the planet. the fallenness of the human condition is expressed in our increased vulnerability to such events. And I've given examples above of how it is sinful human actions, including our wrong priorities, that result in the heavy loss of life, much of which is preventable. Also, could we have, as a result of our fallenness, lost some capacities, such as immunity to deadly viruses and the ability to pick up nature's signals? Think of the way that some animals are able to pick up seismic vibrations and approaching tsunamis and flee for safety. Well, here again, we can only speculate on the possibilities. Furthermore, if the cross of Christ is our guide to the way that we think of the wisdom of God, then that wisdom is seen supremely in the bearing of the brokenness and vulnerability and alienation of the world. And it is this that distinguishes the God of the biblical narrative from other gods. God remains omnipotent in the sense that he can do whatever he wills, but it seems not to be in accordance with his will to insist on total control. I personally think that the control model of divine sovereignty is inadequate to do full justice to the whole biblical picture. Also, by endowing his creation with the power of true becoming, God indwells the temporality of God's creation. The Bible discloses God's identity through an unfolding narrative, a history of divine actions and divine responses. God makes room for the response and the cooperation of created humanity. And that's why the dominant note in the scriptures seems to be one of God making promises for the future, rather than giving exact, detailed predictions of the future. Can we say the same for the created non-human world? Now, these are theologically controversial waters in which I'm treading. God's relationship with God's creation is sui generis. There's nothing comparable to it in the universe. God's relationship with time is unknowable. But along with some modern Christian philosophers and theologians, I would say tentatively that there is a sense in which we may say that God is surprised by the actualization of some events in the world, even as he remains the ontological source and ground of all that is. If the future is truly future, not yet there to be known, then it's no imperfection in God to say that God does not know the future. God knows all the possible outcomes of free actions and free processes, but God knows them as possibilities until a particular outcome is actualized. God knows certainties as certainties and contingencies as contingent. Just as a human artist embodies a purpose in her work and knows in outline what is going to be in it, and in this sense we can say she foreknows the end from the beginning, and yet the material that she works with, the feel of the brushes, the texture of the canvas, the density of the paint, these all contribute to the final product in its actuality. So we may say that God has a real future because of his partnership with the created temporal world, though unlike the human artist, God has freely chosen to work in this way. Finally, when tragedies such as earthquakes and hurricanes strike, the first thing to do is to express our human solidarity with the victims. Inevitably, there will follow the clamoring existential questions and our feeble, stuttering human answers. But more importantly, what we should experience is a sense of indignation, even of outrage, that the same thing always happens, the same people always suffer, and a yearning for things to be different. Let me conclude with some words that I wrote in response to this Indian Ocean tsunami of December 26, 2004. And I quote from a paper that I published. Where was God on the morning of the 26th December 2004? We can say humbly yet boldly that the triune God of sacrificial love was present in the pain and terror of the victims, in the grief of the survivors, in the heroism of people who risked their lives to save others, in the anger and protest expressed against the vulnerability of the poor in a technologically rich world, and in the outpouring of global compassion and selfless giving, in the spontaneous tidal wave of humanity that was as unstoppable as the waves that broke on South Asia's coasts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinoth. We've got about 20 or so minutes for questions before we break for lunch.
Vinoth, thank you for a brilliant talk, and I'm very much in sympathy with all you've said. When it comes to God foretelling the future, I'm largely with you, but in the particularity of the gospel narratives, it does look like Jesus is heading for Jerusalem and knowing what's going to happen, that he's going to be crucified and die for the sins of the world, and so on. There seems to be something that's predicted that's for sure, in a sense, if you like, more than in the sort of general way in which you described.
Yes, a good question. I think we distinguish between actions that we choose to do and things that happen to us as just passive creatures. And I would put Jesus's statements about his coming death as this is the path that he has freely chosen to walk on, because he's fulfilling God's promise. So we do make promises, just as God makes promises. But how those promises are going to be actualized also depends on the actions of creatures. Yes.
In your musings, could you possibly consider that the reason we have problems is that we fail to recognize God as being perfect and his creation as being perfect, and we fail to recognize that we are the sons of a perfect God, and as a result, we suffer from our misconceptions. It's rather like somebody being in the court of a king, and the king looks at him and says, well, who are you? And he said, well, I don't know. But at the moment he says, I am your son, we get to stay in the castle. Our problem is that we fail to recognize that we really are the image and likeness of God, and hence perfect. Isn't the problem in our conception rather than with what God's created? Our conception of ourselves.
I'm not sure how that relates to the subject of natural evil. Would you like to expand on that?
If we recognize that we are the children of God, surely we get forewarning of these disasters and are safe from them. I have a friend who is an Anglican priest who was living in Tamil Nadu at the time of the tsunami, and he's on the beach, and 3 hours before the tsunami strikes, something tells him very vocally, get off the beach. But isn't that a function of the fact we recognize that we're the children of God? Hence, the apparent appearing of evil is something we're saved from because we recognize we're the children of God, and then hence not subject to evil. We have the dominion. Doesn't that?
Well, it's not the way that I would read the Gospels, the New Testament. I mean, God does not save us from the consequences of evil in this life.
But
we suffer because we are part of a human species. We are in solidarity with the rest of humanity, and whatever humanity suffers, we suffer. And sometimes we even choose to embrace the suffering of others.
Thank you very, very much for your for your talk, and I resonate with a great deal of it. As someone who works for Faraday, who's been working in Haiti with the worst, in terms of loss of life, one of the worst earthquakes that has ever happened. I've been interviewing survivors from the earthquake in different demographic groups, sitting with them in their hovels, in their temporary accommodation and in their broken homes and so on. One of the things that has come through very, very much from the research I've done is the significance of the Bible. And in particular, the fact that the Bible told them that earthquakes were due to happen. They may not have had any other information about earthquakes, certainly nothing scientific or anything like that. They just knew from their Bibles that Jesus said earthquakes are going to happen. And it was from that, the sense that a sovereign God was in control, that prevented them going to pieces. I'm very interested in your closing remarks, that you feel that doctrine of the loss of the sovereignty of God and control is an inadequate one. Should I seek to persuade those people to think differently?
Yes, thank you. No, what I said was not that sovereignty, divine sovereignty is something I don't believe in, but rather the identification of sovereignty with the language of control. Bishop Jones said this morning of how God can rework the distortions that we produce in his creation, bringing forth something beautiful out of ugliness. God can use evil to bring good without being responsible himself for the evil. That's how I understand sovereignty. That God is not defeated by any evil situation. He grieves. He's part of, he experiences the pain in a extent that we cannot imagine. He's part of that suffering. He's part of that pain, but he's not overcome by that suffering and that pain. And that's the story of the gospel, isn't it? The resurrection is not about the escaping or evading evil. It is taking the full weight of human evil into oneself and yet overcoming it, defeating it, not succumbing to it. So I understand sovereignty more in the sense of God bringing forth goodness and beauty out of evil and ugliness, and not being defeated by human sin and cosmic sin.
Thank you. There's a hand just further along that row.
You spoke of animals having a nascent moral awareness. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because it makes it sound as if they have a choice, a capability of choosing to do something right or wrong, to choose evil over good. I wonder if you could expand on that a little.
Yes, well, this is a controversial area, and I'm not an expert. I'm not an ethologist or a biologist, but there are some who believe that, yes, that certain animals are capable of compassion, empathy, in a rudimentary sense. I mean, I'd welcome your opinions, those of you who know more about this than I do. But I'm just leaving that window open and saying, well, if there is such a nascent moral awareness, we shouldn't be surprised by it, and God will respond to such creatures in ways that are appropriate to that moral awareness.
I'd like you to articulate a bit more the line between the marigold and the elephant, in which you said that the marigold is not something that we should mourn, whereas the elephant, and I would suppose then the human, we would. Can you articulate that a bit more carefully so that I know where that line fits across a wide array of a billion species or so?
Yes, so the marigold doesn't have any sense of individual identity. There is no, even there's no sense of rudimentary self, whereas with some of the higher apes and dolphins and so on, there is evidence that there is a sense not just of sentience, but of some subjective awareness, which then gives us a deeper sense of responsibility, morally speaking, to such creatures, that we are entitled to treat them as individuals and not just as a species.
But that's not possible then to draw a line and have one either side.
Yes, I mean, all these things, we can't draw clear distinctions, but yes.
Jim.
It's a different ontological level, if you like. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just wondering if you can give me a more, for me actually, a more approachable definition of evil. I mean, it's troubling me since ever. How can you define, for example, evil? What is evil? And when you apply this to the natural evil, can you call a natural evil morally wrong? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
For example, is this kind of disasters, or for example, the movement of the tectonic plates and hurricanes, and this can be called as a natural evil. You can name these catastrophes or the natural way of the world as evil, because this is, for me, I need to have a good
So I personally
definition of evil in order to say that this kind of things are morally wrong, in terms of morally or moral evil.
Yes, and I agree with you. I personally don't use the term natural evil to describe these phenomena. Yes, and same with the language of acts of God that insurance companies use. I mean, we should not speak of these as acts of God, because like I said, it is not God who is sending these things intentionally, deliberately. In fact, during the time of the tsunami, or just after the tsunami, the Salvation Army in Sri Lanka put up this big poster saying, in times of disaster, we do acts of God. Now that's a better way of putting it.
Francis over there, and then I think Hillary at the front.
Thank you, Reverend. I come from Africa, where you find all these evils, war, hunger, famine. Well, it may not be a big challenge for believers, because we've tried to say, but again, we have a high calling to reach out to these people who are suffering, people who they are going through pain. And you go there and you tell them about this big God. I mean, pleasant. Some people who are suffering are even Christians and believers. They're being. In your own opinion, I don't know how, because you are more over the region. These people who you are telling of a good God in the face of all these difficult.
Well, part of the problem, not just in Africa, I think even in this understanding of God, even though they've been in church for decades, really unbiblical. That what happens in the world is in accordance with God's will. If a dictator to sort of teach us something, or if we have an accident, God is disciplining us, God is training us, or God is judging us. And we have to question that view of God. As again Bishop James reminded us this morning in the Lord's Prayer, we're saying, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Why? Because God's will is not done on earth. Much of what we see happening around us is not God's will, and we have to weep and express anger, outrage, that, that this is actually grieving the heart of God.
Sorry for but can God?
So I think Christians have to learn to protest.
Indeed.
And the Psalms, for example, I mean, more than half the Psalms are also protests against God, which we rarely use in our worship.
Yeah, yes, Reverend. But can God use evil to punish people? Look, for example, when you say when a dictator comes to power, like we have seen in Africa, then somebody can say the same Bible says that it is God who gives leadership, you know. It is God who installs people in power. And therefore, if a dictator comes, you say it's God's will and he's there to punish us. I don't know. Can God use evil to punish people? I don't know.
Well, I would say the first question you need to ask is, how did we allow such a person to come to power? What's gone wrong with our political systems, our social systems, our culture? What's gone wrong in the church? In many African countries, the church is the majority religious community. And they are often the most corrupt and evil societies. What's going wrong with us before we start asking questions about God? That's where I would begin.
Other questions? I saw other hands up, and I'm now missing them. Barbara here.
Thank you very much. Are we coming to the conclusion that there is no evil in the heart of God, but there is evil in the heart of humanity?
Well, that is Orthodox Christian belief, yes.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, yes, that God is not evil. You say that God is evil. How can we worship such a God? The problem arises for us. It's because we know that God is not evil, and yet evil seems to be not just so prevalent, but even triumphant in so many situations that we cry like the psalmist, why God? Why do the wicked prosper? And I think that will be our cry, that will be our prayer until the final day of judgment.
Can the evil be described as the absence of God?
Well, Augustine famously spoke of evil as the deprivation of the good. In other words, evil does not have any real substantial, but it is the corruption, it is the perversion of goodness. So love, for example, gets perverted into jealousy or possessiveness, and they are evil. So behind every evil there is an original good that has somehow got twisted, perverted. Yes.
More down here.
I think this is one place where science could perhaps be prophetic with regards to theology, because we Christians or believers tend not to accept the world as it is. We seem to feel that there is a better world that could have been created, and God has created a cruel one. And I think science can help us, and natural theology can help us accept the world as it is, including death and destruction. And I mean, this is of course the way we would explain it. I mean, it's destructive, chaotic, tragic. It's difficult to accept the world as it is. It's difficult to accept. We would rather have had it differently. I mean, we would rather not have had the possibility of tsunamis. And I think as believers, we tend to have an ideal world in our brains, and we tend to wish it had been otherwise. I think science can challenge us in that, to accept the world as it is, and that will change us as believers too, rather than trying then to fault somebody for it, so to speak. Just accept that this is the way God wanted the world to be. I don't know whether that makes sense.
Well, yes, it does make sense. I think we have a more nuanced understanding that, yes, we accept the world as a gift, but like I said, a good gift, but not a perfect gift, not a complete gift. And so there is a sense in which we don't accept the world as it is. And there are things in the world that we must resist, we must protest, we must fight, because they are not God's will. And I've given you examples, the immense loss of life because of these natural disasters, and even the way that, we can't do anything about the way animals treat animals, but we can do a lot about the way we treat animals. So there's a lot that can be done to change the way things are, because our vision, our hope is on a future world in which these evil powers that seem to have taken over God's world will be decisively defeated. And the cross and the resurrection of Jesus are God's promise, God's pledge, God's down payment, if you like, that a new world is coming. And in a sense is already here, but not yet in its fullness. And so we live in this tension between accepting what is, but also being restless and being uncomfortable and being prophetic. That's the role of the prophet, to say, well, this should not be. And science, as much as it's just helping people to conform to the present social, economic, political order, science becomes an obstacle to God's purposes. And we must prophetically challenge science and say, what kind of world is science and technology producing? And we critique that in the light of our vision of what kind of future God has for us and has promised for us.
Thank you. At that point, I think I'm going to draw things to a halt because we have to get for lunch and then the tours later. Vinoth, you've given us a remarkable food for thought.
Thank you.
Stimulated discussion. I'm sure that's going to go on over lunch and for the next few days as well. Thank you so much. Can you join me?